Hello, art history students. Welcome to another video lecture. So today we're going to be talking about rejections of the Rococo. If you're not familiar with the Rococo, you should go back and watch the video from the last unit, which was Rococo and Art Academies. And this artists will have a couple responses to Rococo. So that starts with sentimentality in painting and then moves into Romanticism and Realism. And then the last artwork that we'll see in this lecture sort of begins the birth of modern art. So things are going to start to move kind of fast. This is a period of upheaval, both social, economical, political, who's in power, that ruling class, that aristocracy who loved the Rococo. Their power is starting to fade, and then there will be a transfer of that wealth into what will become the middle class. The Industrial Revolution is also part of what's causing that, and will be a pretty big factor on lives. The Industrial Revolution changes everything. So various styles and periods are going to kind of start to overlap. For the most part, that kind of chronological, remember how I watched, kind of that rise and then fall and then rise and fall of kind of art and prosperity together in this sort of linear thing. That's not going to happen as much. There's kind of a spreading that occurs at this time in history, and we'll talk more about that in the next lecture. Okay, so we're talking about sentimentality in painting. So the lighthearted subject matter and that frivolous kind of beautiful aristocracy, outdoors, being pushed on swings and going on pilgrimages to the island of Cythera, all those things that were very iconic of Rococo, didn't always sit well with all artists. We saw a little bit of the rejection of that with neoclassicism, right, which kind of began within the confines of the art academy, but was kind of seeking that moral message and trying to find historical stories that had a moral message. So now we're going to see art play out and push for that moral message a little bit more, and push specifically against the aristocracy. So the first artwork that we're going to look at is the marriage settlement. Right? So this artwork is part of a series of 6. We're going to briefly talk about the other 6, but this is the one that I really want you guys to know. So just to give you a little bit of context, look at this kind of beautiful setting that these people are in, right? There's kind of this really nice house, and there's sort of these pictures of these ancestors and whatnot. This is actually the couple who is getting married here. Right? We see some sort of legal individuals, right? This is some sort of settlement, so thus there is always kind of legal proceedings involved. These are the 2 fathers here of this young couple. And if you look, there's all kinds of money and paperwork exchanging hands. Like this is some kind of, it's a settlement, right? It's a settlement that has to do with money. This is nothing to do with love and affection. And we can see that in the way that these 2 young people aren't even looking at each other, right? They're about to get married. They're engaged to be wed, and they can barely even stand to look at each other. So let's kind of briefly look at the rest of their story. We're going to look at the story now. So they basically have a bunch of affairs and lose their fortune. One thing that is important to note is that this was turned into prints, and as I've said in this class before, and we will say it again, prints have the ability to be more widely distributed. So these are paintings, which were the originals that told this story, and then the prints would kind of just be copied off of the painting. They were in black and white, they were not in color, and they would be able to be shown at a much farther geographical range. Thus, more people would see them. There's the potential for people to actually have them and own them in a way that paintings were not. A painting is kind of just a one, and a print can make multiples. So keep that in mind. So next in the storyline of this young couple is this one, which is called the Taiyate, right? So this is like a French term. So we see a couple things here. We see this is the same husband. He sort of seems to be kind of drunken and falling over in his chair, right? There is a chair that's overturned where the lover of the wife had to abruptly leave because the husband had awoken. That's the kind of storyline behind this artwork. And I love that little servant guy who is kind of like, oh, I'm needed in another room. He just kind of wants to get away from the situation. So then in the next one, the third one, which is called the inspection, we see the husband and wife, and then this young woman who is his lady friend. Anyway, they're in a doctor's office. So there has been something brought sort of into the family or into the relationship, right? As that would potentially happen in a marriage where there are many affairs. Next, we see the toilette, which is the fourth, right? This is a perfect depiction of those salons that the aristocracy would spend most of their time in, right? Places like Versailles. That's not necessarily where this image is supposed to be taking place, but in this kind of, basically what's happening is all these people are getting dressed up with nowhere to go, right? We see this man here has these kind of curlers in his hair. I know that might be difficult to see what's going on. And then there's another lady here who's getting her hair done and braided, and everyone's just kind of sitting around in this. They don't have to work. They don't have anywhere to go. They don't really have anything to do except for sit around and gossip and those kinds of things. So again, this is sentimentality painting. It is a rejection of all those things that Rococo was. And Rococo painted this lifestyle as this beautiful, wonderful, living in the aristocracy was wonderful, wonderful. And this is kind of a rejection of that. The next one is the bolingo, right? We can see a man kind of crawling out the window, and then the husband figure who's standing there, he's still kind of got that lean, like he might be drinking a little bit, and the wife is kind of begging for forgiveness there. And then last but not least in this series is the death of the lady. And there's a couple things here that I want to point out. One, look at kind of the humble area, right? So in the first image where it was the marriage settlement and there was all that money on the table between the two fathers, like the ceilings were really high and there were all those paintings on the walls. This is a much, much more modest depiction, right? We see the man in the red coat, he sort of has the lady's hand and he's taking the wedding ring off. And I believe his red coat indicates that he is like a debt collector or maybe a tax collector or something like that. And she hasn't even passed away yet, and they are kind of taking the last little bit of wealth that she would have on her. I also love this dog that's over on the other side of the image who's kind of super, super skinny and scraggly. It really kind of puts into perspective where these people came from and kind of where they ended up. And it's really through they just totally mismanaged everything. And that's why they ended up in this situation. And that's kind of the moral message behind all 6 paintings. So let's move on. The next is the marriage contract. And this artwork is vastly different, right? It's this very similar situation to the marriage settlement, but what's being depicted is completely different. So we can see here, right, this is the young couple, just the same as the other one. And note how close they are by comparison to the other couple, right? And how close everyone is in this image, right? There's barely any room. This whole image is like packed with people. There's still some legal things going on, right? This man here, right, is kind of the legal person. So there's still a contract anytime you get married or anything like that. There's always going to be paperwork involved. And one thing that I really want to point out is this father figure, right? How happy he looks. He's kind of in the center of the picture. And basically the focal point is right here, as this father gives him this tiny little satchel of money, which is the dowry for their marriage, right? So even though this couple is in these very humble settings in this kind of downstairs basement house, right? It's nothing luxurious by far. They seem to be so much happier. And we assume that they are going to be happier because they are poor in wealth, but rich in love. And that's kind of a theme that will progress into Romanticism. All right. Okay. So I put this slide in with these two images just to give you guys kind of like a context of how close they are in history. So the first one to come out is the marriage settlement, which is the one of the wealthier couple who gets married, and then the 6 paintings that go along with it, and they were eventually turned into prints and whatnot. So it's not very long after that that the marriage contract is painted. And there's this sort of progression of this idea that this aristocracy is kind of not what society needs, not what you should aspire to have. And then this sort of new thing of marrying for love and being poor but happy is kind of propagating in history, propagating in people's ideas. All right, so what's going on in the world? I just want to take a quick moment to provide some context of exactly what's going on. So basically what's going on in the world can be summed up in one word, which is Napoleon. All right, so this is from a figure who we're actually kind of familiar with from this class. All right, so this is another Jacques-Louis David, right? He's the same guy who painted the Oath of the Horatii. Right? So we talked about this artwork way back at the beginning of class when we talked about crafting and identity. So if you remember, Napoleon has chosen to be depicted in this, there's all these diagonal lines, right, indicating this moment of drama and action. That horse's face is like completely at panic mode. You can tell there's lots of drama as the sky is dark, but Napoleon's face is saying, like, I've totally got this, right? I am in complete control of this chaotic situation. And that's the identity that Napoleon definitely wanted to craft. Here's another example of Napoleon crafting his identity, right? Here's that, wait, let's get a different, all right, here's that blessing hand, which we talked about in this class. And remember when we saw that image of Louis the 14th, and he had that giant robe thing on. This was in the Northern Baroque era. Louis the guy who built Versailles, just as a refresher. He's the one who invented high heels. He had that long kind of fur cape thing that he was wearing, and I told you guys about the little mink weasel creature that was made from, and each of those little black dots was the tail of that. So Napoleon is not choosing this same fabric just because with no reason. There's a clear intention that he knows that people would look to this and recognize it as something that royalty would have worn. Same way with this crown of laurels, right? That's kind of a throwback to Greece and Rome, right? So to the emperors of antiquity. And then he's got that scepter and then the religion. So he's making claim in so many ways, crafting his identity as the ruler, as the one who holds power. All right. Next is Romanticism, right? So this is kind of happening simultaneously. Like I said, a lot of things are happening at the similar time frame. So this is happening simultaneously to sentimentality in painting, but basically kind of grows out of sentimentality in painting. It reflects the turmoil that is happening in Europe as Napoleon is causing all kind of European havoc, and also of the American Revolution. There's this emphasis on individuality and also on sort of this paradox of beauty and tragedy is something else that is very prominent in Romanticism, both in Romantic art and in Romantic literature and stuff like that. There's also a rejection up in the industrialization that's happening, and that thread will kind of continue throughout history for quite a while. So let's get right into it. So this is another Jacques-Louis David. This is the Death of Marat. So in this artwork, David is borrowing quite a few things from kind of the Baroque era and that drama that was created via light. So this is part of I don't want to say this is like a documentation, but this was a real story. So Marat was in France, he was a journalist who was writing things, trying to be a good journalist and kind of being very critical of those who were in power at the time. And he was ultimately then killed for that. And this is not the first example of this at this time in history, and it will not be the last, but this artwork is kind of David's way of putting that, like making people face that, right? Suddenly you are faced with an image of a man who has been killed in the bathtub as he was writing in the bathtub, right? It's sort of this, as he was defenseless, these people came in and took this action. So that's part of why he's making this painting, is to make you as the viewer confront that thing that happened at that time, right? So it's kind of this slightly beautiful image of this tragic thing. So again, that paradox of beauty and tragedy kind of coming to the forefront. We're going to see that more in Romanticism. The next is William Blake's Eelholm, Creating Adam. This was definitely an artwork that was created as a rejection of all of the things that the Academy was putting out at that moment. So Eelholm is it's like a Jewish term for God, right? And that was not the popular religion of the time. We'll use the term popular. It was definitely not the state religion. It was not what you were supposed to call things, right? So there's a lot of kind of rejections of that. And there's also this kind of, this is a beautiful moment that's being depicted, but at the same time, it has that kind of tragic appearance to it, right? It's that same paradox. All right. So here it says it's like this rebellion against Academy traditions. Okay, next we have an artwork by J.M.W. Turner. So I want to ask you guys to take just a moment and kind of, what do you think is going on here? Do you think this artwork is beautiful, right? Do you think it depicts something beautiful? Just kind of give yourselves a moment and what do you think might be going on, or this might be a depiction of, right? Is it just a beautiful sunset and a boat, or could it be something else? So Turner was actually depicting something that's pretty tragic. Ship captains of slave ships would be paid for slaves that were lost at sea, but not for slaves that were brought sick. So any slaves that would be sick would just be tossed over, right? And that is what is being depicted in this artwork, but it's being depicted in this, you're not confronted with it in the same way that David confronted you with the death of Marat. It's not quite in your face. You can't quite tell what's going on. But there is this there's definitely this paradox between this beautiful sunset and this beautiful ocean scene and then the actual content that's being depicted, right? That's a very much so in juxtaposition to each other. This is also technically falls within the realm of Romanticism, right? We talked about this artwork back at the beginning of class also. Right, just to refresh, this lady sort of has this super elongated spine that's not realistic, right? There's also this kind of, where is she? Who is she? This kind of erotic romanticism of another culture, right? This idea that she's the grand odalisque, which is basically like the first wife in a harem, right? Which is not as sexy as it sounds, right? There was just kind of a misunderstanding of cultures at that time, right? There's also this kind of, she's very European, but she's being depicted as this Middle Eastern woman. So there's just kind of a lot of false juxtapositions, but it definitely falls into the Romantic period. All right, so next we're going to talk about one of the most famous Romantic artists, which is Goya. So Goya had a kind of he was a very, very prolific artist. He made a lot of artwork. But his artwork day job was he was the official painter for the royal family, right? So in Spain. So Goya is Spanish, and this is kind of the artwork of his day job, which is not that interesting, at least from our perspective. What's much more which is much more interesting is what Goya painted and did on the side. So these are prints from the Disastrous War series, which this one is called And There Is No Remedy. All right, so this is a print, so it could be much more widely distributed. And basically what we see here is firing squads. These guys in the background are Napoleon's troops. As they're coming through Spain, they're causing a lot of death and destruction. And Goya was confronted with that and wanted people to see that. So he made a lot of artworks that were political for their time, but were also sort of like documentary artworks about what experience was going on. And he certainly did not see war in a favorable way. So this is part of his two-part painting series. This is called the 2nd of May, 1808. And that date is important. So what happens on the 2nd of May is Napoleon's troops come into this larger Spanish town. And this town, you can kind of see here, there's like a wall in the background. This town would have been heavily fortified. So a city, a larger area. And it had its own defensive militia group of residents of the town. So Napoleon's troops come in to try to take over this area. And what ultimately happens is the Spanish militia groups, the Spanish forces, right? So some of them are military forces and some of them are kind of like Minutemen kind of thing, right? They push Napoleon's troops back and actually push them out of the town. And this is a celebratory moment because they're sort of saved from, you know, Napoleon's conquest. But the next day, on the 3rd of May, 1808, Napoleon's troops moved down the road to a much smaller city, a much smaller town. And as a repercussion from being pushed out of this larger town, they basically take all of the men out of this smaller town and execute them immediately. These people were not there. It was a total, like, from history, it's just sort of a vengeful act, right? That's all that's happening here. It's not, these are civilians. These are not other military people. And you see that here, kind of the way the focal point is bringing you right to that center man. And that makes us as the viewer identify with him. And once you sort of know the story, you're very much more empathetic towards that character who the light is being shed on. So let's kind of break this image down visually. Goya uses directional line in a lot of different ways, right? So we have kind of this circling effect. As you go from A to B to C to D to E, there's kind of this circle that wraps around that main central figure. And then this line here kind of, again, points you towards him. All of these, the lines of all these guns are pointing you towards them. I think it's very telling that when Goya decided to depict the Napoleon's forces there, these guys here along this line B, right, their backs are turned to us. That kind of dehumanizes them and really humanizes that man in the center, right? As the light shines on him, right, we kind of see his hands are out. We see, you know, just the sadness and fear in his face, and his face isn't even depicted that strongly, right? It's not it's not a very incredibly well articulated painting. This painting is kind of painterly with quick brush strokes, right? So there's a lot going on in this painting that's being told about history, right? That historical context is very, very important in this artwork, but also the way that Goya is using all those formal qualities to kind of make you empathize with this story, right? And also de-emphasize with these guys. If this would have been a painting that was done by someone who was of Napoleon's troops, right, they would have put themselves in a very different perspective. They would have painted themselves as as like the victors, right, and their faces would be the ones that would be showing. So there's a lot to unpack in this artwork, and I think it's a very well done. How much you empathize with that man in the center is very strong. Goya did an incredible job with making you kind of see him and feel for him, feel for his family, feel for the entire situation. All right, so here is, I'm not going to try to pronounce the artist or the title of this, but this is another example of a artist who was making artwork at the time that was very confrontational to Napoleon and very confrontational to the ruling class at the time. He did a series of political cartoons, basically, in France, and then was told that he was going to be arrested. So he left and went to go stay with friends in the country to try to kind of get away from the situation. And Napoleon's troops came in and killed everyone in the house, not just this cartoon artist. So this is another artist who's making, sort of telling that story, making sure that story from that date on April 15th, 1834 is sort of known, right? So these are all part of the Romantic movement. And that leads us to this artwork in the Romantic movement. And this is Liberty Leading the People. So this is kind of a very interesting artwork in the sense that it both depicts real people and not real people. It's very symbolic artwork. You've probably seen it. Most people have seen this artwork to some degree. So what do we have going on here? We have this woman in the front who is holding the French flag, and she is Liberty. So in one hand, she has this musket, and in the other hand, she has the flag, and she's leading the people sort of up over this ledge where this battle has taken place. And the people that she's leading are coming from all stratas of society. So this boy here is, he's basically like a newspaper / postal delivery boy, right? So this would be obviously someone who's very young, and then obviously someone who's probably from a lower class. This man with his sort of Abraham Lincoln-ish hat, they're not the same hat, but he kind of looks that way. That's the hat of like someone who's of the middle class and slightly more educated. So more than likely like a banker or some kind of an accountant, some kind of merchant, something like that, right? So he's of a middle class. And then this guy back here looks like he's some sort of sailor or dock worker. So again, these two gentlemen on the one side are maybe from a similar age group as opposed to the younger boy, but they're coming from different stratas of society. And Liberty is leading all of them against sort of the multitudes of oppressions that are happening at this time. So let's talk about her. Let's talk about that woman and what's going on. So she's not a real person. Let's make that kind of clear. It's not like she was a woman who was named Liberty. That's not the case. She is a figure that's personified what's going on at the time. And then she also has this kind of bare breast moment here. And this is not a bare breast in the same way that the Venuses would have been depicted or that idealized women would be depicted. This is something that is symbolic. So let's just be honest here for a second. anytime you're out in a public setting surrounded by people and one of your privates would be exposed, that'd be the first thing that you would take care of in that moment, right? But Liberty's not doing that. She has other things to attend to. All of the issues of society and whatnot are not important in this moment. In this moment where she's leading these people, the only thing that is important is leading them, right? It's not important about your status in society or your modesty in society or what you're supposed to be doing at that moment. It's about this exact action that's being taken, right? So there's that element of the bare-breastedness, and then also kind of the vulnerability of it. If you are a policeman and you wear a bulletproof vest, it covers your chest, right? That's where all your major internal organs are, your lungs and your heart. Those are what are really vulnerable, right? And by exposing that in this image, it's exposing the vulnerability that all of these people are having as they try to fight for their freedom, right? So this artwork is very, very symbolic in a multitude of ways. And again, it fits into that romantic notion, right? There's this beauty of this individual, of this woman, of the potential freedoms and liberties that are kind of just on the verge. But yet at the same time, there's a lot of depictions down here of brutality, right? Dead bodies, right? So there's that juxtaposition between beauty and negativity, right? Which is very iconic for the Romantic era. So if you have any questions about this artwork, please email me. All right. So again, many people died. French people rising up against their government, right? French flag, people of all classes and ages. All right. Now we're going to talk about realism. So remember, these things are happening sort of in close conjunction. They're kind of overlapping. It's not like Romanticism ended and realism began. That's not the case. All right. So realism is a movement that specifically happened in France and then spread out from there. And it tries to really call attention to situations, specifically the poor. And realism did not specifically have a social political agenda, but it made a lot of social political statements about the modern reality, right? And that's why it's called realist. So there's one main artist that you need to know from the realist time, which is Gustave Courbet, right? This is the desperate man. They think that this was kind of a slight, not an exact self-portrait, right? But we see this desperation of the moment, right? So this is happening just after the Liberty would have led the people in a, 12 years after, right? So it's that same kind of time frame. 1830 was when the French Revolution took place. So this is in just the aftermath after that. And this would have not been a time of prosperity for everyone. We don't know why this man is so desperate, but we know that there is a situation that he is desperate about, right? We don't know what that is, though. That's going to be kind of a theme with the Romantics, so we don't quite know what the whole situation is. So this is Gustave Courbet's most famous artworks. This is the Stonebreakers. And if you remember to when we talked about the art academies, there were this strict hierarchy, right? So classical paintings went at the top, and they had the largest canvases, and then there were landscapes, which had medium-sized canvases, and portraits, and then still lifes and whatnot were much smaller and towards the bottom, right? If you remember that large division of space. So Gustave Courbet takes one of the largest canvases. Now this canvas is 5 feet by 8 feet. That's a big size. And he does this incredible detailed painting of stonebreakers, right? Which being a stonebreaker was a job. That's someone's occupation, but it is the lowliest occupation within all of society, right? No one wants to be a stone breaker. No one wants that for their children, for sure, right? It is hard work all the time, and it is very, very low pay, right? Oftentimes, and in other times in other societies and in other places, stonebreakers would have been prisoners. That would be like a job or a class that would be denoted for prisoners. So Courbet is painting this. These are not prisoners, just to clarify, but we see this. This is the master stonebreaker here. Wait, let me get a different color. This is the master stonebreaker here, and this is his apprentice, right? This younger boy behind him. Neither of them have their faces turned towards us as the viewer, right? They're both focused on their work, which again gives them this kind of anonymousness. And that is part of why we see a master and a student, or and an apprentice, right? So when this man gets to the stage where he no longer can be the master stonebreaker and can no longer work, this boy then will just take this place, and someone else will take the place of that boy, right? So these are the unseen people in society, the people who would go to the salons would never encounter a stonebreaker, or it would be unlikely that they would encounter a stonebreaker in their everyday lives, right? So that kind of thrusting this bottom level, this bottom class into the face of the upper classes. That's essentially what Gustave Courbet is doing in this artwork. So that's when the term realist was coined. And like I said, it depicts this working class on this very large scale canvas, which was super, super risque for the moment. And then he also, by painting them that large, kind of gives them reverence. It's not just about shoving the fact that they exist into the face of people who would otherwise maybe not know. It's also kind of like, these are the bottom levels of society, are oftentimes the one that everyone else depends on, right? So still kind of like that today. All right. Next, we're going to look at Gustave Courbet's Burial at Ornans, right? So I do kind of love this painting. There's quite a bit of, I don't want to say humor in it, but there's just sort of like this level of, here it is in this painting, that I think is humorous slightly. So Burial at Ornans is not a painting of any one specific individual's burial, right? Usually when we think about all the times that we've talked about burial in the art history context, right? Where there was this idea of preserving the face of the person who has passed away, and how important that was during the times of ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia and other times, right? In the East, in the Eastern cultures, we talked a little bit about ancestral worship and those kinds of things. So burial is important, right? And when someone important is buried, there's sort of this massive monument created to that, right? We think about the pyramids and that kind of thing. Burial at Ornans is a completely anonymous burial, right? There is no, he's not saying that this was so and so, or that this was, you know what I mean? It's like this, kind of like this everyday event that happens, and it will happen again. So there was a burial at Ornans, there will be another burial at Ornans. All of these people that you see in this painting will eventually be buried at Ornans. Just to clarify, Ornans is a place, it's like a location. So that's kind of this repetition, this anonymousness, this depiction of everyday life, this thing that usually when in art, when a burial happens, is like this elevation to it, right? This creation of the idea that it can last forever, right? Like the death masks and whatnot. And this one is kind of just people die. You know what I mean? There's kind of that, I don't want to say, maybe I was wrong when I said humor, because that's not the best way to put it, but there's this kind of reality to it. That's a better term. All right, this is one of Gustave Courbet's last paintings, not the last, but from the later point in his career. And this is The Painter's Studio, a real allegory concerning the last 7 years of my artistic life. So what's going on here? Gustave Courbet is right in the center. He's in the very center of the painting, right? And he's working on a painting. There's a child watching him. There's other people behind him watching him paint, right? When Gustave Courbet first became a painter and he did something like the Stonebreakers, he was like a rebel without a cause, right? Like he was sort of ostracized a little bit, and he was in constant controversy. And then eventually, as his career progressed, he then became incredibly famous. And there was no, he had already rebelled against the Academy, and that was the ultimate authority in the art world. So once he broke that mold, he was then famous, and there was I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I don't think there was the same amount of pleasure in it as there was before. Another thing that we noticed, there's this nude woman there, but he's not painting that, right? She's kind of longingly looking at the canvas, right? You would think if she might have been a model or something for a painting, but that's not even what he's working on at that moment. So he's kind of talking about how all these people are sort of flocking to him as this famous artist, and he doesn't feel that way anymore. So that's the allegory that he's painting. And I think it's very much in the realist tradition, right? I see the same kind of sense, the same sensibility as the Burial at Ornans. This is just how it is, you know what I mean? That's kind of what you see coming across in this artwork. All right, last but not least is Manet. So Edvard Manet is the last artist that we're going to talk about for today, and we're going to talk about 1863. I told you guys way back in the beginning of this class that I would be very clear when dates would be important of artworks. So 1863 is an incredibly important year for the art world. So I want you guys to kind of look at this artwork, Olympia, and just kind of refresh some of the artworks that we've seen in the past. Does this look like any that we may have seen before? Right? Maybe back from the Venetian Renaissance? So to put these side by side, right, Manet's Olympia and then Titian's Venus of Urbino, you can kind of see that Manet is clearly looking to art history. There are so many things that are similar between these two artworks, right? And then also so many things that are vastly different. So one thing I want to point out is, who is this lady in Manet's painting? So she is a young call girl, so basically a prostitute who he paid to be his model for this painting. Basically because this Titian's Venus of Urbino, she would have been a mistress, right? She would not have been a wife of the household. So there's a little bit of a social kind of like, why do we regard this one painting of this one person in such high regard when they're basically the same thing, is what he's kind of getting at. So he's making a social statement about who the person is who's being depicted. It was a very conscious choice to choose this young lady, right? Another thing to note is how she's looking directly at you, right? And not in the same kind of happy way as the Venus of Urbino is, right? Olympia is looking directly at you with almost a sense of disdain. She's depicted on the same sort of white fabric. There's like this dog here in this one, and then the cat here in this one, and then there's these two maids, right? These two ladies attendants, I guess you could call them, and then this one here in this painting who holds all this fabric. This one has a much deeper sense, the Venus of Urbino has a much deeper sense of space, right? We see the space receding a lot differently, and Manet's Olympia is kind of a little bit more flattened, but this was a very clear use of where one came from the other. So this artwork kind of is technically in the realist moment. But Manet is most famous for the next artwork that we're going to see, which begins modern art. The next artwork begins modern art. And modern art kind of just, like, traditions of the past are pushed away. And there's a lot of experimentation that's going to happen from that. And there's all kinds of fresh ideas that are going to come about. And another thing I really want to point out is there's this tendency away from the narrative. We saw the beginnings of that with realism, right? With Courbet's The Stonebreakers. There was no narrative of who those two people were. There was no need for iconography, right? Of who was who. It was sort of this anonymousness about it that we, you know, the only sort of semblance of a narrative was someday that master stonebreaker will stop being the master stonebreaker and the apprentice will move into that position, right? That's the bulk of the narrative, right? So there's definitely a tendency away from that. So let's finally get to this artwork. So this is Edvard Manet, same guy who painted Olympia, and this is called Luncheon on the Grass. So this artwork caused, again, 1863, caused a massive controversy. It was not exhibited in the Salon. It was rejected and then was actually exhibited in the Salon of the Refused. But let's break down just a couple of things real quick. We have this woman here, right, who is looking out at you. Right? She's looking directly at the viewer. She's not idealized, right? She's not a Venus. She's not some sort of nymph from historical story that is just birthed or something like that, right? We can actually see her clothes and her hat over here. So she's a contemporary woman who was wearing contemporary clothes, and now she's just naked in the woods with these two fully clothed men, which is risque in itself, right? And they're not really talking to each other, right? So the one man is kind of gesturing at the other, but he isn't really making eye contact with him. She is kind of separate from them. She almost looks like she's like a sticker that you could peel away. Then there's this woman in the background who is, for the distance that she's supposedly away from them, she's enormous, right? Who is she? So she appears to be taking a bath back there or washing her hands or feet or something in the water. But if she were to walk forward into the foreground with these other characters, she's like twice the size of them. So Manet is not like, these are all very conscious choices. These are not mistakes that he's made, right? He's made very clear conscious choices to give all the elements of narrative, all the elements of who could this person be? Who could that person be, right? Who's that person in the background? They look like they're interacting, but they're not. But there is no narrative. And that was very intentional that he was doing, was using all those elements that art had used for so long in history and placing them together, but not giving them that same content and historical context and the narrative, right? We've had story time with Lacey quite often in this class, so we know the narrative is important. All right, we will talk more about this artwork in the next lecture or the lecture after. All right, so again, 1863, it was rejected and shown in the Salon of the Refused, and then this artwork marks the beginning of modern art, which we will talk more about in the future. These are the key terms. If you have any questions, please send me an email. I am happy to answer any questions. So thank you. That one got long.